Why did the Byzantine Empire really fall? And how could a city that had survived 1,000 years of wars, sieges, plagues, and betrayal finally be silenced in a single spring morning? The answer does not begin with cannons or armies or fire, but with belief, the unshakable belief that Constantinople could never fall. For centuries, the people of the city had looked at their walls and seen not stone, but destiny. They called it the Queen of Cities, the Eye of the World, the final light of Rome. Its harbors glittered with trade from 3 continents, its churches echoed with prayers older than kingdoms, and its golden domes caught the rising sun, as if heaven itself had chosen this place to endure when all others faded into dust. The city stood where Europe met Asia, where empires collided and faiths clashed, and yet it remained, generation after generation, like a rock in a storming sea. Every child born beneath its towers grew up hearing the same story. Constantinople was protected by God, guarded by walls no enemy could breach, destined to stand until the end of time. From the sea, the city appeared like a vision from legend. 3 layers of colossal walls stretched across the landward side, rising higher than any siege tower and thicker than any battering ram could shatter. Towers crowned the battlements at regular intervals, each one a silent sentinel watching the plains beyond. On the waterside, the city was shielded by the deep blue embrace of the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, natural barriers that had broken fleets and swallowed armies. The very geography of Constantinople seemed designed for survival, a fortress crafted not by human hands, but by fate itself. Travelers who approached its gates often fell silent, overwhelmed by its scale. Even hardened soldiers who had marched through a dozen campaigns would whisper that no force on earth could take this city by storm. Inside the walls, life moved with an ancient rhythm. Markets filled the air with the scent of spices and baked bread, the clang of metal from blacksmiths' workshops, and the murmur of merchants bargaining in dozen languages. Monks crossed narrow streets with lowered eyes, while scholars debated philosophy in candlelit rooms. Sailors unloaded silk, grain, and precious stones from distant lands, and pilgrims knelt in churches that glittered with mosaics of gold and glass. Constantinople was more than a capital. It was a memory of Rome that refused to die, a bridge between worlds, a living museum of empire. But beneath the splendor, there was something else, something quieter and more dangerous than any enemy army. The empire had shrunk year by year, century by century. Once its banners had flown from Spain to Syria, from the Danube to the deserts of Egypt. Now its lands were little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories clinging to distant coasts. The streets still bustled, the churches still shone, but the empire that had built them was fading like an old painting, its colors dimming while the frame remained. The people of Constantinople knew this, yet they clung to their faith in the city's invincibility. They had survived Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders, and plagues that had emptied entire districts. Each time they endured, and each survival strengthened the illusion that survival was guaranteed. Far beyond the horizon, new powers were rising. Kingdoms that once feared Byzantium now saw it as a relic, a jewel ready to be taken. Trade routes shifted, armies modernized, and new weapons appeared on battlefields across the world. Yet in Constantinople, the bells still rang at dawn, and the faithful still gathered under the great dome of Hagia Sophia, confident that the city's long history of survival would continue forever. It was this confidence, this deep and comforting belief in eternal endurance, that made the coming fall so unimaginable. The tragedy of Byzantium did not begin with the first cannon blast or the first breached wall. It began with the certainty that such a thing could never happen at all. They believed the city could never fall. But outside the shining walls of Constantinople, the world had already changed in ways its people did not fully understand. And the real collapse of Byzantium had begun long before a single Ottoman soldier set foot before its gates. For centuries, the empire had survived not because it was always the strongest, but because it was the most adaptable, the most patient, and the most skilled at turning enemies into allies and disasters into delays. Yet by the 15th century, that old flexibility had hardened into pride and exhaustion. The empire that once commanded vast legions now struggled to field even a modest army, relying more on mercenaries than loyal soldiers and more on diplomacy than power. Gold that had once funded fleets and fortresses now vanished into court intrigues, religious disputes, and desperate payments to foreign rulers whose friendship lasted only as long as the coins kept flowing. Constantinople still looked magnificent, but beyond its walls, entire provinces had been lost, reclaimed, and lost again, until the empire resembled an island of memory surrounded by seas of rising powers. Trade routes that once filled its markets with wealth had shifted westward, feeding the cities of Italy and the growing kingdoms of Europe, while the eastern roads that once brought silk and spice now passed through lands controlled by new empires that no longer respected Byzantine privilege. Every year the city felt a little poorer, though its people tried not to notice, clinging to ceremonies, titles, and traditions that spoke of past glory rather than present weakness. Inside the palace, political struggle consumed precious energy, as emperors fought not only foreign threats, but rivals within their own family, generals who dreamed of the throne, and church leaders who argued endlessly over doctrine, while armies gathered beyond the borders. Religion, once a unifying force, became another line of division, splitting the empire between those who sought help from the Latin West and those who would rather see the city fall than submit to Rome. This endless internal tension drained strength at the very moment unity was needed most. Yet from within the walls, it all seemed like just another chapter in a long history of crisis and recovery. After all, Byzantium had faced disaster before and always endured, so why should this time be different? But beyond the shrinking frontiers, a new kind of state was forming, younger, more energetic, and driven by leaders who had grown up in a world where Byzantium was no longer feared, but studied as prey. The Ottomans had begun as one of many small Turkish principalities, yet through careful strategy, relentless expansion, and a talent for absorbing conquered peoples into their system, they had built a power that now surrounded Constantinople on almost every side. Villages that once paid taxes to Byzantine governors now supplied soldiers to Ottoman armies, and fortresses that had guarded imperial roads now flew new banners. Each loss might have seemed small at the time, a distant province too costly to defend, or a fortress sacrificed for peace, but together they formed a tightening ring that slowly strangled the empire. The tragedy was not that Byzantium did not see danger at all, but that it had grown used to living with danger, mistaking delay for victory and survival for strength. Emperors negotiated truces, paid tribute, and married daughters into foreign courts, believing that time could still be bought as it had been for centuries. Yet every year the price grew higher and the returns smaller. By the time the final crisis approached, Constantinople was less the heart of a great empire and more a magnificent city-state, proud, historic, and spiritually powerful, but dangerously alone. Its walls were still tall, its churches still radiant, its citizens still convinced that history itself protected them. Yet the balance of power that had once favored Byzantium had shifted beyond recall. The empire had not collapsed in a single battle or a sudden betrayal. It had thinned like worn cloth, thread by thread, until only the glittering surface remained. And when the storm finally gathered on the horizon, the city would discover that splendor and memory were not the same as strength. When Mehmed II first looked upon the walls of Constantinople, he did not see an ancient city protected by destiny. He saw a challenge that would define his life and prove to the world that the age of Byzantium was over. Barely in his 20s, the Ottoman Sultan possessed a dangerous mix of patience, intelligence, and ambition, and unlike many rulers before him, he was not content with tribute, temporary truces, or symbolic victories. He wanted the city itself, the prize that had resisted conquerors for 1,000 years, and he was willing to reshape his empire to take it. While Byzantine diplomats still believed they could manage the Ottomans through negotiation, Mehmed was already preparing for a siege on a scale the medieval world had never seen. He strengthened his navy to cut off aid from the sea, reorganized his army to ensure discipline and supply, and most importantly, invested heavily in new military technology that would change the rules of warfare. Gunpowder had been used before, but Mehmed understood its future in a way few others did, and he sought out engineers and cannon founders from across Europe and Asia, offering gold and protection in exchange for their skills. Among them was a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who claimed he could build cannons powerful enough to shatter even the Theodosian walls, those legendary fortifications that had protected Constantinople for centuries. The Byzantines, short of money, had turned Urban away, but Mehmed welcomed him. And under Ottoman patronage, enormous cannons were cast, weapons so large that transporting them required teams of oxen and entire units of soldiers. These were not just tools of war, they were symbols of a new age in which walls alone could no longer guarantee safety. At the same time, Mehmed tightened his grip on the land surrounding the city, capturing key fortresses and building new ones along the Bosphorus to control traffic between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. One such fortress, Rumeli Hisari, rose on the European side of the strait, its towers looming as a clear message to Constantinople that the Ottomans now commanded the lifeline of the city. From its walls, Ottoman artillery could fire on any ship that tried to pass without permission, effectively strangling Byzantine trade and communication. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI understood the danger but had few options. He appealed to Western Europe for help, promising church union and religious concessions, yet the response was slow and limited. Europe was divided, suspicious, and distracted by its own conflicts, and while a few volunteers and ships would eventually come, no great army marched east to save the ancient capital. Meanwhile, Mehmed trained relentlessly, studying previous sieges, strengthening supply lines, and ensuring that when the moment came, his forces would not simply surround the city, but overwhelm it with numbers, firepower, and determination. He was not driven by hatred alone, but by a vision of empire, one in which Constantinople would become the jewel of a new Ottoman world, the center of power between Europe and Asia. The contrast between the two leaders could not have been sharper. On one side, an aging empire clinging to memory and faith. On the other, a rising state fueled by youth, innovation, and relentless ambition. By the spring of 1453, the preparations were nearly complete, and the young sultan, who had grown up hearing stories of failed sieges and impossible walls, was ready to prove that this time would be different. For him, Constantinople was not just a city, it was a promise,
and he intended to claim it.
For nearly 1,000 years, the Theodosian walls had stood as the ultimate symbol of Constantinople's strength, a layered system of stone, towers, and moats that had turned back Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and countless other armies who had believed the city could be taken by force. Rising in tiers across the landward side of the capital, the walls stretched for miles, their outer defenses designed to slow attackers, their inner ramparts towering high above the plain, lined with battlements from which defenders could rain arrows, stones, and fire upon anyone who dared approach. These fortifications were not just military structures, they were psychological weapons, and generations of citizens had grown up believing that as long as the walls stood, Constantinople could never truly fall. Even as the empire shrank and its resources dwindled, the walls remained a source of pride and reassurance, a reminder of the city's former greatness and divine protection. Emperor Constantine XI knew, however, that walls alone would not be enough this time, especially against an enemy who possessed cannons unlike any the Byzantines had ever faced. Still, he ordered every possible repair, mobilizing craftsmen, soldiers, monks, and even ordinary citizens to patch cracks, strengthen gates, and prepare defensive positions. Stones were hauled into place, wooden platforms reinforced, and towers stocked with supplies. The city's defenders were few in number, perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 in total, including foreign volunteers, but they were determined, and many believed they were fighting not only for their homes, but for the survival of the Christian East itself. Among them were experienced Genoese and Venetian soldiers, skilled in siege warfare, who took positions along the most vulnerable stretches of wall. The atmosphere within Constantinople grew tense but resolute, a strange mixture of fear and faith. Churches filled with worshippers, prayers echoing beneath domes and vaults as priests and monks called upon divine protection, while outside the city gates, the reality of the approaching Ottoman army became impossible to ignore. Scouts reported vast numbers of troops gathering, tents spreading across the countryside like a second city, and massive cannons being dragged into position with enormous effort. When the Byzantines first saw the great guns, their size alone caused unease, but many still trusted that the walls, blessed and time-tested, would hold as they always had. After all, they had survived centuries of assault, and the city had endured when empires around it had crumbled. Yet this confidence masked a critical truth. The walls had been designed in an age before gunpowder artillery had matured into a true siege-breaking force. The defenders could repair damage, but repeated bombardment would test even the strongest stone. Constantine walked the ramparts personally, encouraging his men, inspecting defenses, and sharing in their hardships, determined to show that their emperor would not hide behind palace walls while others fought. His presence inspired loyalty, yet it could not change the imbalance in numbers and firepower. Beyond the horizon, the Ottoman army continued to grow, its banners fluttering in the spring wind, its soldiers preparing for a siege that would not rely solely on brute force, but on persistence, engineering, and modern weapons. As both sides readied themselves, the stage was set for a confrontation between medieval fortification and early modern artillery, between tradition and innovation. The people of Constantinople looked at their mighty walls and saw salvation. But history was about to reveal that even the strongest defenses can become relics when the world changes around them. When the first Ottoman cannon fired, The sound rolled across the fields outside Constantinople like thunder that refused to fade, a deep, violent roar that seemed to tear the sky itself, and for many within the city it was the moment they realized this siege would not be like the others their ancestors had survived. The ground trembled, birds scattered from towers and rooftops, and a heartbeat later a massive stone ball slammed into the outer defenses of the Theodosian walls, sending chips of ancient masonry flying into the air. The walls that had stood for centuries, that had defied emperors and caliphs, now faced weapon born of a new age. Mehmed II had invested heavily in artillery, hiring skilled engineers and founders to create bombards of terrifying size, including the massive cannon cast by the Hungarian engineer Urban. These guns were slow to reload and difficult to move, but their power was undeniable, and each shot was a reminder that technology had begun to outpace tradition. Inside the city, defenders rushed to the impact sites, working frantically to fill cracks with earth, stone, and timber, forming makeshift inner barriers behind damaged sections. Buckets of rubble, wooden beams, and sacks of soil were dragged into place by soldiers, laborers, and even monks who labored side by side under constant threat of another strike. Every repair was temporary, every hour of work bought with exhaustion and fear. Constantine XI moved along the walls as often as he could, encouraging his men and sharing their danger, determined that morale would not collapse before the stones did. Yet the psychological toll of the bombardment was immense. Day after day the cannons fired, their thunder echoing across the city, shaking homes, churches, and nerves alike. People began to measure time not by the sun or the bells, but by the intervals between blasts. Sleep became shallow and uncertain, conversations hushed and tense. Even those who had once believed the walls were invincible could see the growing scars in the stone, the widening breaches that had to be patched again and again. Still, the defenders refused to yield. Archers and gunners returned fire with what artillery they possessed, small cannons and ballistae mounted on towers, harassing Ottoman crews whenever possible. Night brought no true rest, as repairs continued under torchlight and watchmen scanned the darkness for signs of assault. Beyond the walls, Mehmed's army tightened its grip, building trenches, moving guns closer, and coordinating attacks to keep pressure on multiple points. The siege was becoming a test of endurance, and the Ottomans could afford patience in a way the Byzantines could not. Supplies within Constantinople were limited, and every day under bombardment drained both resources and resolve. Yet hope lingered in whispers. Perhaps help would come from the west, perhaps a fleet would appear on the horizon, perhaps the walls would hold just long enough for fortune to change. But as the cannons continued their relentless rhythm, it became clear that the old certainty that Constantinople could outlast any siege was fading with every shattered stone, replaced with a grim understanding that this time the enemy was not only outside the gates, but inside the future itself. While the cannons battered the land walls, another struggle unfolded along the waters of the Golden Horn, the sheltered inlet that curved like a protective arm around the northern side of Constantinople. For centuries, this harbor had been one of the city's greatest strengths, a natural defense and a vital lifeline for trade and supply. A massive iron chain stretched across its mouth, anchored at one end near the city and at the other in the Genoese district of Galata, preventing hostile ships from entering. As long as the Golden Horn remained secure, the Byzantines could still hope for relief by sea, and maintain contact with friendly powers across the Mediterranean. Ottoman ships, though numerous, could not force their way past the chain without suffering heavy losses from the city's defenders and allied vessels. Mehmed understood this problem well, and rather than batter his fleet uselessly against the barrier, he conceived a plan that would become one of the most famous maneuvers in siege warfare. North of the Golden Horn rose steep hills and wooded slopes, terrain that seemed to protect the harbor from any naval approach. But to Mehmed, these hills were not an obstacle, they were an opportunity. Under cover of darkness and secrecy, Ottoman engineers and laborers prepared a road of greased logs and wooden planks across the ridges behind Galata. Then, in an astonishing display of coordination, dozens of ships were hauled out of the Bosporus, dragged overland, and lowered into the Golden Horn behind the chain. The operation required immense effort. Oxen strained against harnesses, soldiers pushed and pulled, and crews guided vessels along the slippery track, all while muffling noise to avoid detection. At dawn, the people of Constantinople awoke to a sight that seemed impossible. Ottoman sails now floated on the waters of the Golden Horn itself, inside what had been considered a secure harbor. Panic rippled through the city. The chain, symbol of their maritime safety, had been rendered meaningless by ingenuity and determination. The defenders rushed to reinforce seawalls and reposition their limited naval forces, but the psychological shock was severe. Now the city was threatened not only from the west, where the land walls faced the main army, but also from the north, where Ottoman ships could land troops, mount artillery, and stretch Byzantine defenses even thinner. Constantine XI and his commanders worked frantically to adapt, redistributing men and weapons to cover the new danger, but every soldier sent to guard the harbor was one less available to repair breaches in the walls or repel assaults. The Ottomans, meanwhile, pressed their advantage, building floating batteries and launching attacks along the shoreline. Fire ships and skirmishes lit up the nights, and the once calm waters of the Golden Horn became a new front in the siege. For the citizens, the sight of enemy banners reflected in the harbor's surface was a cruel reminder that the city's legendary defenses were being outmaneuvered piece by piece. The chain had not been broken, yet it had been defeated, and with it another layer of confidence fell away. Constantinople was no longer a fortress surrounded by barriers of stone and sea. It was a shrinking island of resistance, encircled on all sides by a force that seemed to be able to turn even geography itself into a weapon.
Even as the outer defenses groaned under the weight of Ottoman bombardment and naval pressure, deeper fractures were widening inside Constantinople itself. The city that once commanded an empire stretching across continents had, by the 15th century, shrunk to a shadow of its former self. Vast districts within the walls lay abandoned, their once bustling streets now overgrown with weeds or occupied by small clusters of farmers who cultivated fields where palaces had stood. The population, drastically reduced by centuries of war, plague, and economic decline, could not hope to fully man the extensive fortifications that had once required tens of thousands of defenders. Every tower, every gate, every stretch of wall demanded attention, and there were simply not enough trained soldiers to cover them all. Emperor Constantine XI relied on a fragile coalition of Byzantine citizens, foreign volunteers, and mercenaries. Among them were Genoese troops under the experienced commander Giovanni Giustiniani, whose presence and professionalism gave the defense much-needed structure.
Yet cooperation among these diverse groups was not always smooth. Cultural differences, language barriers, and questions of authority created tension. Some locals resented the influence of Westerners, whose churches followed the Latin Rite, while others feared that promises of aid from Europe would never truly materialize. Religious divisions, long a wound in the body of Christendom, lingered even as the enemy stood at the gates. The recent union of the Eastern and Western churches, agreed upon in hopes of securing Western military support, was deeply unpopular among many Orthodox citizens, who saw it as a betrayal of tradition. In whispered conversations in homes and monasteries, some even muttered that it was better to fall under Ottoman rule than to submit to Latin domination. Such sentiments, though not widespread, revealed a troubling lack of unity at a moment when unity was vital. Logistical problems compounded the strain. Food supplies, though carefully rationed, were limited. Every day of siege meant more mouths to feed and fewer opportunities to replenish stores. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly to repair weapons and armor damaged by constant fighting, but raw materials were scarce. The great cannons of the Ottomans could shatter stone. The defenders had little artillery to answer in kind, relying instead on smaller guns and traditional methods of defense. Morale rose and fell with each skirmish. A successful repulse of an Ottoman assault might bring cheers and renewed hope, but a single breach in the wall or a rumor of betrayal could send waves of anxiety through the population. The clergy organized prayers and processions, carrying icons along the streets and invoking divine protection. For many, faith was the strongest remaining shield, a belief that the city chosen by emperors and saints would not be abandoned in its darkest hour. Yet even faith could not silence the distant thunder of cannons or the growing sense that time was running out. Emperor Constantine moved tirelessly among the defenders, encouraging soldiers, overseeing repairs, and sharing in their hardships. His presence inspired respect, but it could not conjure reinforcements from across the sea. The promised fleets from the west did not appear on the horizon, and each dawn revealed the same grim reality. The Ottoman army remained, vast and relentless. Inside the walls, courage endured, but it was a courage stretched thin by exhaustion, doubt, and the knowledge that they stood almost alone against a force determined to reshape the map of the world.
The sound that defined the siege was not the clash of swords or the cries of soldiers, but the deep, rolling thunder of artillery that echoed day and night across the Bosphorus. Mehmed II had brought with him a new kind of weapon, one that symbolized the changing face of warfare and the fading power of medieval defenses. Among his arsenal stood enormous cannons cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, whose ambition had found a willing patron in the young Ottoman Sultan. These massive bombards were unlike anything the defenders had ever faced. Their barrels were so large that a man could crawl inside them, and each stone projectile they hurled weighed hundreds of kilograms. When fired, the ground seemed to shake. Birds scattered from rooftops, and a trail of smoke marked the path of destruction as the stones slammed into the ancient walls. For centuries, the Theodosian walls had resisted every enemy, their layered defenses and deep moats turning aside armies from Persia, Arabia, Bulgaria, and countless others. But those fortifications had been designed for an age of ladders, siege towers, and catapults, not for the relentless pounding of gunpowder artillery. Each impact cracked mortar, loosened stones, and sent fragments cascading down into the ditch below. The defenders worked frantically to repair the damage under cover of darkness, hauling stones, timber, and earth to reinforce weakened sections. By day they fought, by night they rebuilt. It was a desperate rhythm, exhausting both body and spirit. The great cannon, known as the basilica, required hours to cool and reload, but Mehmed had many smaller guns that kept up a steady bombardment. The psychological toll was as heavy as the physical damage. Every explosion reminded the people of Constantinople that their legendary walls were no longer invincible. Dust and debris filled the air, and entire neighborhoods near the walls lived in constant fear of collapse. Churches held special services, and citizens gathered in prayer, asking for miracles that might silence the guns. Yet the cannons continued their work with indifferent persistence. Mehmed understood that time favored him. He did not need to storm the city immediately if the walls could be slowly reduced to rubble. Still, impatience burned in him. He rode along the lines, inspecting batteries, urging his engineers to aim more precisely, and rewarding those who brought down sections of the fortifications. The Ottomans built protective earthworks and mantlets to shield their gunners from Byzantine counterfire, turning the siege into a contest of endurance and innovation. Inside the city, defenders began to concentrate their efforts on the most threatened sectors, especially near the gate of St. Romanus, where the walls suffered the heaviest damage. Giovanni Giustiniani and his men became a familiar sight there, directing repairs and organizing resistance. The emperor himself often appeared at the front, encouraging laborers and soldiers alike. Yet even as bravery and determination held the line, a grim truth emerged. The balance of power had shifted. Gunpowder had rewritten the rules of siege warfare, and Constantinople, proud heir of Rome, now stood as the ultimate test of whether ancient strength could withstand modern force.
Inside the walls, the siege was no longer an event, but a condition of existence. Days blurred together, measured not by the calendar, but by the rhythm of bombardments, alarms, and hurried repairs. Food became scarcer with each passing week. Granaries that once supported a bustling imperial capital now struggled to feed a population swollen by refugees from the countryside. Rations were carefully distributed, bread grew coarse and thin, and meat became a memory for most families. Markets still opened, but their stalls offered little beyond dried beans, onions, and what fish could be caught in the Golden Horn. Prices rose, and anxiety simmered beneath every transaction. Yet life did not simply stop. Children still played in narrow streets, though their games were quieter, their laughter edged with nervous glances toward the walls. Priests led processions through the city, carrying icons and relics believed to hold protective power. Crowds followed, chanting prayers that echoed between ancient buildings, seeking comfort in ritual as uncertainty tightened its grip. At night, the glow of candles filled churches as citizens gathered to ask for deliverance, their whispered pleas blending with the distant rumble of Ottoman guns. The emotional strain weighed heavily. Some believed firmly that divine intervention would save the city, recalling past sieges when enemies had been driven away. Others, more pragmatic or more fearful, began to lose hope. Rumors spread quickly in a city under pressure. Stories of breaches in the walls, of entire districts abandoned, of secret negotiations with the enemy, all circulated, growing more dramatic with each telling. The authorities tried to maintain order, but tension was always close to the surface. The emperor and his advisors walked a delicate line, needing to project confidence while knowing how fragile the situation truly was. Soldiers rotated between the walls and brief rests in the city, their armor dented, their faces blackened with soot and dust. They spoke of the enemy camps stretching beyond sight, of the endless stream of reinforcements and supplies flowing to Mehmed's army. For them, the siege was a physical ordeal, long hours of watchfulness, punctuated by sudden bursts of violence. Wounds were common, and medical care was basic at best. Still, morale did not collapse. Pride in the city's history and faith in its destiny held many together. Merchants, artisans, monks, and nobles all shared the same fate, bound by the walls that enclosed them. In this shared hardship, old divisions sometimes faded. Latin and Greek Christians who had once argued over theology now stood side by side on the ramparts. Ordinary citizens helped carry stones and earth to reinforce defenses, transforming streets and courtyards into networks of support for the front lines. Yet beneath this solidarity lay a growing exhaustion. Every day the siege continued, hope drained a little more, replaced by a grim determination simply to endure until either relief arrived or the end came.
Deep dawn now began with the same dreadful expectation. Before the sun fully rose over the Bosporus, a deep silence would settle for a moment across both camps, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Then the thunder came. The great cannon, Mehmet's monstrous weapon cast by the Hungarian engineer Urban, roared to life again, its explosion shaking the ground beneath Constantinople like an earthquake. The sound was not just loud, it was physical, a force that struck the chest and rattled the teeth. Birds burst from rooftops in panicked clouds, dogs howled, and even the bravest soldiers flinched despite themselves. A few heartbeats later, the massive stone ball would smash into the land walls, tearing away chunks of masonry that had stood for 1,000 years. Dust and fragments filled the air, turning sections of the ramparts into choking clouds of grit and smoke. The defenders rushed forward the moment the shot landed. Men with picks, shovels, and baskets worked frantically to fill gaps with rubble, timber, and earth before the next round came. They built makeshift barriers in the night, only to watch them crumble again under the relentless bombardment. The cannon could not fire continuously. It took hours to reload and cool, but its psychological impact was enormous. Each shot was a reminder that time favored the attackers. The ancient walls, once believed indestructible, were being slowly worn down by a technology the Byzantines could not match. Smaller Ottoman guns joined the assault, peppering the fortifications with constant impacts. Where once the walls had stood smooth and imposing, now they were scarred, patched, and uneven, like a wounded giant struggling to remain upright. The defenders learned to read the rhythm of the artillery. When the guns fell silent, they scrambled to repair. When the thunder returned, they ducked behind shields and prayed the next stone would not strike their section. Casualties mounted not only from direct hits, but from falling debris and collapsing structures. Dust coated armor and skin, mixing with sweat, until every soldier looked like a statue carved from ash. Sleep became scarce.
Night brought its own dangers as Ottoman sappers tried to dig tunnels beneath the walls to plant explosives or undermine foundations. Byzantine engineers listened with ears pressed to the ground, trying to detect the faint scrape of digging before it was too late. Countermines were dug, and brutal underground fights broke out in cramped, airless passages lit with flickering torches. Above ground, the city watched the walls change day by day. Citizens climbed rooftops to glimpse the damage, whispering in fear at the growing breaches. Still, the line held. Each evening, battered but unbroken, the defenders stood atop the repaired ramparts and looked out at the endless sea of enemy tents. The giant cannon might shake the earth, but it had not yet broken the will of the city.
When the guns fell silent after sunset, the siege did not sleep. Darkness brought a different kind of war, one fought not with thunder and fire, but with shovels, whispers, and the slow, suffocating scrape of metal against soil. Beneath the shattered fields before the walls, Ottoman sappers labored like moles, digging tunnels toward the foundations of Constantinople's defenses. Their goal was simple and terrifying: burrow under the walls, pack the chambers with explosives or timber supports, then collapse them, bringing towers and ramparts crashing down from below. Above ground, the defenders could not see this threat, but they could feel it. Byzantine engineers and miners, many of them experienced from Balkan silver mines, pressed their ears to the earth inside the city, listening for vibrations. In quiet cellars and at the base of towers, men lay flat against the soil, holding their breath, straining to catch the faint, rhythmic scratching that meant the enemy was coming from beneath. When they heard it, they began digging counter-tunnels, racing blindly toward the sound. These underground passages were cramped, airless, and pitch dark, lit only by oil lamps that burned the oxygen away. When opposing tunnels finally broke into each other, brutal hand-to-hand combat erupted in spaces too tight to swing a sword properly. Daggers, short spears, and even bare hands became weapons. Smoke was sometimes pumped into enemy tunnels to suffocate the diggers. In other cases, fire was used to collapse passages. The fighting underground was savage and desperate, but it saved the walls more than once. Each destroyed Ottoman tunnel was a silent victory, though few citizens ever knew how close disaster had come from below their feet. Above, the city lived in a strange half-life between hope and dread. Churches filled nightly with prayers, candles flickering before icons darkened by centuries of smoke. Priests spoke of miracles, of angels guarding the walls, of divine tests of faith. Some believed the Virgin Mary herself would protect the Queen of Cities as she had in past sieges. Others prayed more quietly, fearing that heaven had already turned its face away. Food grew scarcer. Horses disappeared first, then dogs, then anything that could be boiled into broth. Yet morale, though strained, did not collapse. The emperor continued to walk the walls, speaking with soldiers, sharing their rations, offering words of gratitude. His presence mattered. In a city where emperors had once ruled half the known world, this last emperor stood as a symbol that the empire still lived, even if only within these battered walls. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman camp, patience and pressure defined strategy. Mehmed knew that every day the walls weakened and the defenders tired. The great cannon would fire again at dawn. The tunnels would continue creeping forward in the dark. The siege had become a contest of endurance, and both sides understood that time itself
was now a weapon.
As the siege dragged into its most dangerous phase, both sides began to sense that the struggle was approaching its final act, and the mood around Constantinople changed from grim endurance to tense anticipation. Inside the city, every breach in the walls was patched with desperate ingenuity. Rubble, timber, overturned carts, and even furniture from abandoned homes were dragged to the weak points to reinforce them. Monks worked beside soldiers, nobles beside laborers, all distinctions blurred by the shared understanding that survival now depended on every pair of hands. Blacksmiths hammered day and night, repairing dented armor and reshaping broken spearheads, while women and elderly citizens carried stones to the ramparts, forming human chains that moved in silence except for the dull clatter of rock on rock. The great chain across the Golden Horn still held, denying the Ottoman fleet an easy approach, but rumors spread that the enemy was planning something unexpected. Scouts reported strange movements near the hills north of the harbor, wagons rolling at night, timbers being gathered, paths being cleared. Few could guess that Mehmed was preparing to do what no attacker had ever done before: move ships over land. In the Ottoman camp, the Sultan intensified his efforts with relentless discipline. Supplies flowed steadily in from his empire's vast resources, and fresh troops rotated to the front lines, keeping morale and strength high. Mehmed consulted engineers, astrologers, and generals alike, blending calculation with belief. He was young, but he carried himself with the certainty of someone convinced that history had chosen him. He ordered the construction of massive wooden tracks greased with animal fat and oil, and under cover of darkness, hundreds of men began hauling lighter vessels from the Bosporus across the hills and down toward the Golden Horn. When the sun rose and the people of Constantinople looked toward the harbor, they saw Ottoman ships where none had been before, floating inside what they had believed was their safest water barrier. Shock rippled through the city. The chain still blocked the main entrance, but the enemy had simply gone around it. Panic threatened to rise, yet the emperor and his commanders forced themselves into action, scrambling to reposition defenses along the sea walls, which were far weaker than the massive land fortifications. Meanwhile, artillery fire intensified once more. The great cannon and its smaller companions pounded the walls with renewed fury, widening cracks, shaking towers, and filling the air with dust that hung like a constant fog. Sleep became a luxury no one could afford. Each dawn brought bombardment, each night brought repairs and prayers. The sense of inevitability began to creep into conversations, though few dared speak it aloud. Still, the defenders did not surrender. They had held for weeks against one of the most powerful armies in the world, and as long as the emperor stood among them, as long as the crosses still rose above the churches and the banners still flew over the gates, Constantinople remained unconquered in spirit, even as the physical city slowly crumbled around them.
As the walls trembled under unending bombardment, and Ottoman ships floated menacingly within the Golden Horn, the leaders of Constantinople gathered for what many feared would be their final council. It took place in a dim chamber lit by wavering lamps, the air heavy with dust and exhaustion. Emperor Constantine XI sat at the head of the table, armor resting beside him, his face drawn not by fear, but by the weight of responsibility. Around him stood generals, noblemen, Venetian captains, and church leaders, men who had once debated trade, theology, and politics, now united only by the question of how long the city could endure. Reports were delivered in hushed voices. Ammunition was running low. Several towers along the land walls were barely holding together. Casualties were mounting faster than they could be replaced. The sea walls, never meant to withstand a major assault, were now exposed to Ottoman ships that had appeared as if by sorcery. Some suggested sending envoys to Mehmed to negotiate terms, hoping for mercy in surrender. Others argued that surrender would bring slavery, humiliation, and the end of everything the city represented. Constantine listened to each voice, then rose and spoke with quiet firmness. He reminded them that Constantinople had stood for over 1,000 years, that its survival had never been guaranteed, and that every generation before them had faced moments when defeat seemed certain. He did not promise victory, only honor. If the city were to fall, he said, it would fall with dignity, not in panic. His words did not erase fear, but they gave it shape, turning despair into resolve. After the council, he walked the walls himself, speaking to soldiers by name when he could, thanking them, encouraging them, sharing bread and water with the wounded. The sight of the emperor among them strengthened morale more than any speech could. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman camp, Mehmed finalized his plans for a full-scale assault. He knew the defenders were exhausted, and he intended to strike with overwhelming force. Orders spread through the ranks. At the next signal, waves of troops would advance in succession. First irregulars to exhaust the defenders, then elite janissaries to break through weakened points. Engineers prepared ladders, siege towers, and explosive charges. Drums beat through the night, a steady, ominous rhythm that carried across the fields and into the sleepless city. Inside Constantinople, churches filled with people praying not just for survival, but for strength to face whatever dawn would bring. Bells rang, candles flickered, and voices echoed beneath domes that had seen emperors crowned and armies repelled. Now they witnessed something different, a city bracing itself for its final test. Outside the walls, thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay ready under the stars, while inside, a much smaller force tightened its grip on spears and swords, knowing that when the attack came, there would be no turning back, only a last stand written into history.
Darkness settled over Constantinople like a heavy cloak, and for the first time in weeks the cannons fell mostly silent, a pause that felt more threatening than the constant thunder of bombardment. Fires burned low along the battlements as soldiers conserved fuel and strength, their armor dented, their hands blistered, their eyes hollow from too many sleepless nights. Word had spread quietly through the city that the Ottomans were preparing for a massive assault at dawn. The knowledge hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all. In homes near the walls, families gathered close together, whispering prayers, sharing what little food remained, listening for every distant sound. Some wept softly, others sat in stunned silence, and a few clung to fragile hope that perhaps somehow the attack would fail like so many before it. In Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had stood for centuries as the spiritual heart of the empire, a final service was held. Nobles stood beside merchants, soldiers beside monks, Latins beside Greeks, divisions that had once caused bitter conflict now meaningless in the face of a common fate. Candles illuminated faces streaked with tears and determination as hymns echoed beneath the vast dome, their voices rising in defiance of fear. Emperor Constantine attended the service, kneeling among his people rather than apart from them. Those who saw him later said his expression was calm, almost serene, as if he had already accepted the outcome. When the prayers ended, he returned to the walls once more, moving quietly through the night, speaking to commanders, checking positions, ensuring every gate was secured. Beyond the walls, the Ottoman camp was alive with preparation. Torches flickered like a sea of fire as officers moved among the ranks, issuing final orders. Weapons were sharpened, armor adjusted, ladders inspected. The massive cannons were readied for a renewed barrage at first light. Mehmed himself walked among his elite troops, reminding them that the city before them was the prize of centuries, the gateway between continents, the jewel of the Christian world. Victory here would make them part of history. His words stirred both excitement and grim resolve. For many Ottoman soldiers, this was not just a battle, but a holy mission, a chance for glory and reward. Yet even among them there was tension. They knew the walls were formidable, the defenders desperate. Casualties would be heavy. Back inside Constantinople, small groups of defenders gathered in quiet corners of the walls, sharing final words, mending straps, sharpening blades in the faint light. Some carved crosses into stone or kissed small icons they carried. Others simply stared out into the darkness where thousands of enemies waited. The air was cool, carrying the scent of the sea and distant smoke. Hours passed slowly, each one bringing dawn closer. No one truly slept. Every creak of wood, every distant shout, every gust of wind made hearts race. This was the stillness before the storm, a fragile moment suspended between history and legend, when an ancient city held its breath, knowing that with the first light of morning, everything would change forever.
Before the first pale light touched the eastern sky, the silence shattered as Ottoman drums began to thunder across the dark fields, and thousands of voices rose in a roar that seemed to shake the earth itself, a sound meant not only to signal attack, but to break the spirit of the defenders before steel ever met flesh. From the walls, the Byzantines watched the enemy lines come alive with movement, torches swinging, banners lifting, officers shouting commands that rolled forward like waves. Then the cannons spoke again, their explosions tearing through the dawn air, hurling stone and iron against the battered Theodosian walls that had protected the city for 1,000 years. Each impact sent tremors through the ramparts, loosening stones, widening cracks that defenders had struggled desperately to repair during the night. Dust filled the air, mixing with smoke and the smell of salt from the nearby sea, turning the sunrise into a red haze that made the battlefield feel unreal, like a vision of the end of days. The first Ottoman assault wave surged forward, irregular troops and volunteers sent to exhaust the defenders and test the weakest points. Arrows and bolts rained down from the walls, stones were hurled, boiling liquids poured where ladders touched stone. Cries of pain echoed below as attackers fell, but more climbed over their bodies, driven by fear of their own officers as much as by hope of glory. Constantine moved along the inner wall with his commanders, directing reinforcements wherever the pressure grew too great, his armor marked by dust and sweat, his voice steady as he urged his men to hold just a little longer. Every defender understood that this was the decisive moment. There would be no relief army, no miraculous fleet appearing on the horizon. The city stood alone.
After hours of brutal fighting, the first wave faltered, leaving piles of fallen men at the base of the walls, but there was no time to celebrate. Trumpets sounded again, and a second wave advanced, better trained, more disciplined, carrying heavier shields and longer ladders. Behind them, engineers pushed siege towers and portable bridges toward breaches that the cannons had widened. At the gate of St. Romanus, the bombardment had opened a jagged gap where masonry and earthworks barely held together, and it was there that the struggle became fiercest. Defenders fought hand to hand among broken stones, slipping in blood and rubble, striking with swords, axes, and anything they could wield. The noise was overwhelming, a constant clash of metal, shouts in many languages, the deep boom of guns still firing overhead. Above it all, the great banners of both sides whipped in the rising wind, symbols of faith and empire locked in mortal contest. Yet even as the Byzantines repelled one assault after another, exhaustion began to claim them. Many had been fighting for weeks with little rest or food, their numbers too small to replace the wounded. Each time they drove attackers back, fewer of their own returned to the line. Constantine saw this, and though he refused to show despair, he knew the truth. The walls might stand another hour, perhaps two, but they could not endure forever. Beyond the smoke and chaos, the elite janissaries waited, silent, disciplined, the final reserve that Mehmed had held back until the defenders were stretched to breaking. As the sun rose higher and the third assault wave formed, every man on the walls felt the same cold realization settle in his chest. The battle for Constantinople had entered its final, irreversible stage, and history was about to turn with a force no one could stop.
As the morning sun climbed above the smoky horizon, the battlefield at the gate of St. Romanus became the heart of the storm, a place where dust, blood, and shattered stone merged into a single choking haze. The Janissaries advanced at last, their ranks tight and silent at first, shields locked, tall white hats visible through the drifting smoke. Unlike the earlier waves, they did not rush blindly. They moved with grim precision, stepping over the fallen, climbing over broken masonry, pushing forward as a single, relentless body. Behind them, officers shouted commands in sharp, disciplined bursts, and drums beat a steady rhythm that seemed to echo like a heartbeat of iron. The Byzantine defenders, already exhausted from hours of combat, felt the difference immediately. These were not desperate volunteers or irregular fighters. These were professionals raised from childhood for war, trained to break walls and men alike. Constantine rode or ran along the inner defenses, calling for every available soldier to reinforce the breach. Genoese mercenaries under Giovanni Giustiniani held the critical position, their armor dented, their shields splintered, yet still they fought with desperate resolve, knowing that if this point failed, the city would be open. The Janissaries reached the broken outer wall and poured into the shattered zone where earthworks and debris formed a jagged slope. Arrows and gunfire from the defenders tore gaps in their ranks, but more filled the spaces instantly. Hand to hand, the fighting became savage and intimate, blades striking shields, men grappling and falling together into the rubble. The noise was a constant roar of metal, cries, and explosions as Ottoman artillery continued to fire, even as their own troops advanced, trusting in chaos to favor numbers. Then came the moment that changed everything.
Giustiniani, wounded badly by a projectile that pierced his armor, was carried from the line. His removal, whether necessary or not, sent a ripple of panic through the defenders, who relied on his leadership and discipline. Rumors spread that the position was lost, that retreat was ordered, that the Genoese were abandoning the walls. Confusion, more deadly than any cannonball, took hold. Some units fell back to secondary lines, others continued fighting without coordination. The Ottomans sensed the shift instantly. Their officers drove the Janissaries harder, shouting that the walls were breaking, that victory was within reach. Step by step, the defenders were pushed from the outer breach to the inner wall. Constantine himself fought among the men, striking with sword in hand, refusing to withdraw. He had already discarded imperial insignia, choosing to die as a soldier rather than flee as an emperor. Yet even courage could not replace numbers or restore order once fear began to spread. A small Ottoman group found a partially open postern gate or weak point near the breach and raised their banner on a tower. When defenders saw the enemy flag within the walls, a cry went up that the city had been entered. That single sight shattered what remained of organized resistance at St. Romanus. Men who had held firm through hours of slaughter now faced the truth that the line behind them was gone. Some fought on, others retreated toward the city streets, and the breach widened from a crack into an open wound. The Janissaries surged through, not as a trickle, but as a flood, and Constantinople, which had stood against centuries of siege, finally felt the weight of an enemy inside its living heart. The fall was no longer a possibility. It was happening in real time, unstoppable, irreversible, as history itself seemed to tilt and slide toward a new age.
The city was no longer a fortress, but a battlefield of alleys, courtyards, and shattered stone as Ottoman troops spread inward from the breaches, their war cries echoing between churches and homes that had stood for centuries. Fires began to rise in scattered districts where fighting spilled from the walls into the streets, and civilians who had believed the defenses would hold now ran in confusion, clutching children, icons, and whatever possessions they could carry. Amid this chaos, Emperor Constantine XI refused every chance to flee. Witnesses later said he asked only one question, not how to escape, but where the fighting was thickest. Stripped of imperial robes and wearing simple armor, he moved toward the sound of battle near the Lycus Valley, where defenders were making a desperate stand among barricades of overturned carts and rubble. Around him gathered a small group of loyal soldiers, Greeks and foreigners alike, men who understood that the empire they served was ending with the life of its last emperor. There were no speeches, no grand proclamations, only a grim resolve as they formed ranks and faced the advancing Janissaries pushing deeper into the city. The Ottomans moved with terrifying speed now, seizing gates from the inside and opening them for more troops, their numbers multiplying by the minute. Arrows and musket fire cut through the narrow streets, and the clash of steel rang from every direction. Constantine fought as a common soldier, striking, parrying, and retreating step by step as the defensive lines collapsed. Some later claimed they heard him cry out that the city was lost, and that it was better to die than live to see its ruin, though in the roar of battle, words blurred into legend. What is certain is that he refused to surrender. Surrounded as Ottoman soldiers closed in, he disappeared into the crush of combat.
His body was never conclusively identified, though stories spread that he fell beneath a heap of the slain, anonymous in death, just as he chose to be in his final hour. His end symbolized more than the fall of a ruler. It marked the extinguishing of a line that stretched back to Constantine the Great and the founding of the city itself. As word spread that the emperor was dead, organized resistance crumbled. Some defenders continued isolated fights, barricading streets, or making last stands in churches, but the unified defense was gone. The Ottomans pressed forward toward the heart of Constantinople, toward the palaces and great squares that had once hosted imperial ceremonies and triumphs. Bells that had rung for centuries now sounded in alarm, or were silenced forever. Refugees flooded toward Hagia Sophia, believing the great church would offer sanctuary, while others hid in cellars or attempted to flee toward the harbors, only to find Ottoman ships already controlling the waters. The fall of Constantine in the streets transformed the siege into conquest. Without a leader, without walls that mattered, the city became prey to the victors. Yet in that final act of defiance, dying sword in hand among his soldiers, Constantine ensured that the empire did not fade quietly, but ended in a blaze of tragic dignity that would echo through history long after the smoke of battle cleared.
With the emperor dead and the defenses shattered, Constantinople passed from siege into sack, and the sound of battle gave way to the darker noises of conquest. Ottoman soldiers fanned through the streets in waves, breaking down doors, pulling terrified families from homes, and seizing anything of value that could be carried. The narrow lanes that once bustled with merchants and pilgrims now filled with smoke, cries, and the heavy tramp of boots. For centuries, the city had been the richest prize in the eastern Mediterranean, its churches adorned with gold mosaics, its houses filled with silks, spices, and coins from distant lands, and now all of it lay exposed. According to the customs of medieval warfare, a city taken by storm was granted to the victors for plunder, and Mehmet's troops took full advantage of that grim tradition. Churches were stripped, relics smashed or stolen, and sacred vessels melted down for their precious metal. Homes were looted, doors hacked apart, and families separated as captives were gathered to be sold into slavery. The horror was not limited to the poor districts. Even noble houses and monasteries were dragged into the chaos. Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had defined the skyline for 1,000 years, became a place of desperate refuge as thousands crowded inside, believing its walls might shield them. Instead, Ottoman soldiers forced the doors, and the vast interior that had once echoed with hymns filled with the cries of captives being rounded up beneath the great dome. Yet even amid the brutality, Mehmet II had a plan that extended beyond simple destruction. He knew the value of the city he had taken, and before the day ended, he would move to halt the uncontrolled violence that threatened to ruin his prize. But for crucial hours, the fate of Constantinople lay in the hands of soldiers driven by exhaustion, adrenaline, and the promise of reward. Streets that had seen imperial processions now saw chains of prisoners being marched toward gathering points. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and fear. Some citizens attempted to hide, sealing themselves in cellars or behind false walls, while others tried to bargain, offering jewelry or knowledge in exchange for mercy. A few neighborhoods were spared the worst, often because a commander imposed discipline or because resistance had been minimal, but many others endured the full storm of conquest.
The sack was not endless, but its impact was devastating. By the time order began to be restored, thousands had been killed and tens of thousands were enslaved. The population that had already dwindled over centuries of decline was cut again, leaving entire quarters eerily silent. For those who survived, the world they knew ended in a single day. The empire that once called itself eternal had not only fallen politically, its capital had been physically broken open and reshaped by violence. Yet the story of that day is not only one of destruction, because even as the smoke rose, Mehmet was already considering how to transform the captured city into the heart of a new empire, ensuring that Constantinople would not vanish from history, but be reborn under a different banner.
When the worst of the looting was brought under control, Mehmed II rode through the shattered gates of Constantinople not as a mere conqueror, but as a ruler already imagining the future of his new capital. He did not come to erase the city from existence, as so many invaders had done to other great centers of the ancient world. He came to claim it, reshape it, and make it the heart of something even larger. Standing before the scarred walls and smoke-stained skyline, he understood that Constantinople's true value was not only in its treasures, but in its position, its history, and its symbolic power. A city that had once ruled the eastern Mediterranean could serve again as the center of an empire, even if that empire now spoke Turkish instead of Greek and followed Islam instead of Orthodox Christianity. One of his first acts was to enter Hagia Sophia, not to destroy it, but to convert it. The great cathedral, with its soaring dome and vast marble interior, was transformed into a mosque, its Christian symbols gradually covered, while its structure remained intact, a powerful statement that the city's legacy would not be obliterated, but absorbed. Mehmed ordered repairs to begin almost immediately, summoning craftsmen and laborers to restore damaged buildings, clear rubble, and revive the markets. He understood that a capital without people was useless, so he encouraged migration into the city, inviting Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across his territories to settle there. Entire communities were relocated, given homes and workshops in the emptied quarters, slowly bringing life back to streets that had fallen silent. The administrative system was reorganized, with new officials appointed, and taxes structured to support rebuilding rather than pure extraction. Constantinople, soon to be known as Istanbul, began to shift from a battered Byzantine capital into a vibrant Ottoman metropolis. Yet this rebirth came at a cost. The old ruling elite of Byzantium was gone or scattered, its institutions dissolved, its imperial court reduced to memory. Churches that remained were placed under Ottoman authority, their communities allowed to continue, but within a new political and legal framework. The Patriarch of Constantinople was reinstated, not as a rival to the Sultan, but as a religious leader responsible to him, a clever move that ensured loyalty while preserving a measure of continuity for the Christian population. Mehmed's vision was pragmatic and ambitious. He wanted a city that reflected his empire's diversity and power, a crossroads of trade, faith, and culture. Within years, the scars of the conquest began to blend into new construction, new markets, and new rhythms of life. The skyline changed as minarets rose beside ancient domes, and the call to prayer joined the sounds of bells and merchants' cries. Constantinople had fallen, but it had not died. Instead,
It was reborn as the seat of an empire that would dominate the region for centuries, proving that the end of one civilization could become the foundation of another.
The fall of Constantinople did not end the story of Byzantium in a single violent moment. Instead, it sent out ripples that would shape the world for centuries to come. As the last defenders were cut down and the imperial banners lowered forever, the legacy of the Eastern Roman Empire began a strange transformation, no longer tied to a city or a throne, but carried in memory, in books, in ideas, and in the quiet persistence of faith and culture. Scholars who had fled the city before and during its final days carried with them manuscripts that had survived since antiquity, works of philosophy, science, and literature that would soon help ignite the Renaissance in Western Europe. The knowledge preserved for 1,000 years in Byzantine monasteries and libraries flowed outward, influencing art, learning, and thought far beyond the fallen walls. At the same time, the Orthodox Christian world looked to Moscow and other centers for leadership, giving rise to the idea that the spiritual mantle of Byzantium had passed elsewhere, that Rome had fallen twice but lived on in new forms. Politically, the fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe. The Ottoman Empire, now in control of the great crossroads between continents, became a dominant power, reshaping trade routes and military balances. European kingdoms, cut off from traditional Eastern routes, began to search for alternatives, voyages that would eventually lead to the discovery of new continents and the beginning of global exploration. In this way, the death of one empire indirectly opened paths to entirely new worlds. Yet for those who had lived through the siege, the consequences were more immediate and personal. Families were divided, homes lost, traditions forced to adapt under new rulers. Some communities endured, adjusting to life within the Ottoman system, while others faded away or merged into the new order. The city itself, reborn as Istanbul, continued to stand at the meeting point of continents, its streets layered with memories of emperors and sultans, of churches turned to mosques, of markets that never fully forgot the languages once spoken there. Looking back, the fall of Byzantium was not simply a military defeat. It was the end of a political structure that had been weakening for generations, worn down by internal divisions, economic strain, and relentless external pressure. The final siege was the closing act of a long, slow decline that had been unfolding long before Mehmed's cannons fired their first shots. And yet, even in its end, Byzantium proved that empires do not vanish without leaving traces. Its laws, art, theology, and learning survived, carried into new contexts, influencing civilizations that outlived the empire itself. The story of how the Byzantine Empire really fell is therefore not only a tale of walls breached and banners lowered, but a reminder that the true life of a civilization extends beyond its political survival. Constantinople fell, the empire ended, but the ideas, faith, and knowledge nurtured there continued to shape the world, whispering through history long after the last emperor lay dead on the battlefield.